Long before the cannons roared and the battle cries echoed through the valleys, there was silence, a heavy, patient silence, the kind that stretches across an ocean between rulers and the ruled, between a king in London and farmers in Virginia. It was not a silence of peace, but of waiting, of something stirring yet unnamed. In the year 1763, Britain stood tall, proud and triumphant from the 7 Years' War. Her red-coated armies had marched across continents. Her flag waved over distant seas. But victories come with cost, and the British Empire was deep in debt. Parliament looked across the Atlantic to the American colonies as a source of revenue. The decision seemed simple. The colonies, protected by British soldiers, should help pay the bill. But to the colonists, this was no fair request. It was an insult. They had tilled the land, fought alongside British troops, built cities from swamps and forests. Now, without a voice in Parliament, they were being taxed, silently, remotely, like strangers in their own home. The fire did not start with muskets. It started with ink, on paper. The Sugar Act was passed. Then the Stamp Act. Next came the Quartering Act, forcing colonists to house British soldiers. These weren't just taxes. They were reminders of who held the reins. In taverns and meeting halls, whispers turned to questions, then to anger. In Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty began to stir. Writers penned fierce pamphlets. Merchants refused British goods. Women spun their own clothes. A quiet rebellion had begun, not in violence, but in principle. In 1770, in the cold streets of Boston, snowballs flew. Words turned to shouts, then to blood. British soldiers fired into a crowd. 5 colonists fell. It would be called the Boston Massacre. And still, the fire grew. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party painted the harbor brown. Chests of tea worth a fortune floated like corpses. Parliament answered with wrath, the intolerable acts, punishing laws meant to break the spirit of rebellion. But they did the opposite. The colonies, once scattered and uncertain, began to unite. In Philadelphia, delegates gathered, the First Continental Congress. They were not ready for war, but they were ready for resistance. Letters were sent to the king. Pleas were made, but no answer came. Only ships, only soldiers. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a storm waiting to break. In the fields, men trained in secret. In churches, preachers spoke not just of salvation, but of liberty. In homes, children listened to stories of ancient republics, of Rome, of Athens, of freedom won and lost. In the shadows of empires, a new idea was being born. Not a colony, not a rebellion, but a nation, still unborn, kicking in the womb of conflict. The fuse had been lit, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the powder. It was April 19th, 1775. In the sleepy village of Lexington, Massachusetts, farmers and blacksmiths stood shoulder to shoulder with muskets clutched in trembling hands. Across the field, British redcoats marched in formation, sent to seize weapons and silence the unrest in Concord. No one knows who fired the first shot, but when it rang out, it shattered the illusion of peace. 8 colonists died that morning, but their deaths birthed a new truth. The colonies were at war with the British Empire. The shot heard round the world, they would call it. A whisper turned to thunder. By the end of that day, thousands of colonial militia, known as Minutemen, had surrounded Boston. Roads were blocked. Gunpowder was hoarded. The revolution had begun. A month later, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened again. This time, there was no room for petitions. The time for decisions had come. They named a tall, quiet man from Virginia to lead the colonial army, George Washington. He had fought bravely in the French and Indian War and now took command of a ragged force of farmers and volunteers, men with no uniforms, little training, and fewer supplies. In June, the first major battle arrived, Bunker Hill. The colonists fought fiercely from atop a hill near Boston, mowing down wave after wave of redcoats. They only retreated when their ammunition ran dry. Though technically a British victory, it was a costly one. Over 1,000 British soldiers fell. From that hill, the British saw something terrifying. Not just resistance, but resolve. Meanwhile, voices grew louder, not just for rebellion, but for independence. One of them came from a man with no rank or wealth, but a gift with words, Thomas Paine. His pamphlet, Common Sense, was passed from hand to hand like fire. Why should an island rule a continent? He asked. His words burned through fear and doubt, calling for a complete break from the crown. In July of 1776, the colonies took a step that would change history forever. 13 colonies, divided by distance, language, and belief, united to declare something audacious. Independence. Led by the pen of Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It was not just a political document. It was a prayer, a vision, a spark for the ages. That same summer, British ships filled the New York harbor. Thousands of redcoats prepared to crush the rebellion. Washington's army, poorly trained and outnumbered, suffered brutal losses. Yet the spirit did not die. Liberty had no army, no navy, no crown, but it had a cause, and that was enough to fight. The war had truly begun. The road ahead was long, filled with frost, fire, and blood, but the colonies had crossed a line they could never return from. They were no longer subjects. They were revolutionaries. By 1777, the war had become a test of will. The British Army, better trained and better equipped, captured cities and burned homes. Washington's ragtag army, poorly fed and barely clothed, stumbled from defeat to retreat. But the spirit of the cause refused to die. That year, in the forests of New York, came the first great turning point, the Battle of Saratoga. British General Burgoyne marched south expecting to crush colonial forces easily. But American generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold met him with unexpected fury. The trees became traps. The rivers swallowed their supplies. After days of brutal fighting, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. It was more than a victory. It was a message to the world. The Americans could win, and the world listened. In France, Benjamin Franklin had spent months negotiating in shadowed salons, pleading the colonial cause to kings and ministers. Now, with Saratoga as proof, France joined the war. Supplies, ships, money, and men began to flow to the colonies. One of them was a young French nobleman, Marquis de Lafayette, just 19, who would fight beside Washington like a son. But even as foreign help arrived, hardship deepened at home. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge was not a battle, but a trial. Snow fell like silence. Tents froze. Horses died. Men wrapped their bloody feet in rags. Disease swept the camp. Hunger gnawed at the bones of heroes. Washington watched his army suffer, but they stayed. They trained, and under the strict, brilliant Baron von Steuben, the Continental Army transformed into something new. Not just rebels, soldiers. Out of that cold came steel. Out of that frost came fire. In the South, the war turned vicious. British commanders hoped to rally loyalists, but instead unleashed chaos. Entire towns turned into battlegrounds. Brother fought brother. But heroes also rose. Nathaniel Greene, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Men who fought with cunning, speed, and guerrilla grit. And yet, not all victories were noble. Benedict Arnold, once a hero of Saratoga, felt overlooked and betrayed. Hungry for glory, he sold secrets to the British. His betrayal was a knife to the heart of the revolution. But the cause held. Every defeat, every betrayal, every wound, they stitched the colonies closer, like scars on a body that refuses to die. By 1781, the war had dragged for 6 long years. Britain was growing weary. The colonies were broke. But something was shifting. The French Navy moved toward the American coast. Washington saw an opportunity, a trap. He led a bold march to the small town of Yorktown, Virginia, where British General Cornwallis had dug in. French ships blocked the sea. American and French troops surrounded him by land. For weeks, cannon fire lit the skies. Trenches were dug. The British waited for rescue. It never came. And on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. An empire bowed its head. The war was not yet officially over, but in the minds of the people, it was won. And as American and French flags fluttered in the breeze, and drums rolled across the blood-stained field, a silence fell. It was the sound of a war ending. But not all battles end on the field. Even as celebrations rang out, the colonies still faced questions. How would they live together? Who would lead? Could 13 colonies truly become one nation? For 2 more years, negotiations dragged on. In faraway Paris, diplomats Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams faced the British across cold marble tables. Words now carried the weight of musket balls. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States of America as a free and independent nation. The war, at last, was over. From the ashes of empire, a republic had risen, but the land it stood on was scarred. The people were poor. The government was weak. The dream had been won, but it still needed building. 13 states, like distant siblings, were bound more by war than unity. Each had its own currency, its own laws, its own pride. The war had taught them how to fight together, but not how to govern together. At first, they tried to rule under the Articles of Confederation, a document born of fear, built to keep power away from any one ruler. But it was too weak. The federal government could not tax, could not enforce laws, could barely speak with one voice. Trade faltered. Debts mounted. Veterans went unpaid. Chaos whispered through the cracks. Then came Shays' Rebellion, a cry of hunger and betrayal from farmers in Massachusetts. They had fought for freedom, but now faced prison for unpaid debts. Armed with pitchforks and muskets, they rose against the very system they'd helped create. The rebellion was crushed, but its echo shook the nation. "This is not peace," people whispered. "This is collapse." Leaders knew something had to be done. In 1787, they gathered in Philadelphia once more. Not to tweak the old system, but to forge a new one entirely. The Constitutional Convention. Inside Independence Hall, behind shuttered windows and guarded doors, men argued, pleaded, and dreamed. Washington presided. Franklin advised. Hamilton, Madison, and others debated for months. They spoke of power and people, of states and liberty, of fear and faith. From their words came a miracle of ink and compromise, the Constitution of the United States. We the people, it began, not kings, not lords. People. It created a government of 3 branches: legislative, executive, judicial. It gave rights, checks, balances. It was imperfect, it was bold, and it was unlike anything the world had seen. But it was only words on paper, until the people made it law. In 1788, after heated debates in homes, churches, and town squares, the Constitution was ratified. The new nation, once a patchwork of rebellion, now had a heart. And in 1789, the final piece was laid. George Washington, the man who had led through war and walked away from power, was elected the first president of the United States. On a crisp spring morning, he stood on a balcony in New York City, placed his hand on the Bible, and took the oath. "So help me God," he whispered, and the Republic breathed for the first time. As the new Republic took its first breath, not all its people could breathe freely. Beneath the soaring words of liberty, millions remained unseen, their stories untold. The enslaved still toiled under sun and sorrow, promised nothing but silence. Native nations watched their lands vanish, their treaties ignored. Women stitched the fabric of revolution, but found no seat at the table. And poor farmers, who had fought, bled, and believed, were left to struggle alone. The revolution had kindled hope, yes, but not for everyone. It declared freedom, but delivered it unevenly. This was not the end of the fight for liberty, only the beginning. And in the next chapters of America's story, the forgotten would rise, again and again, to ask the question that still echoes today: who is freedom truly for? The past isn't over. It only waits for someone to ask the next question. Which moment in history still haunts you? Which untold story do you want us to bring to life next? Drop your suggestion in the comments section. We just might turn your idea into our next film. And if this journey moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that shaped us all. Because history isn't gone, it's only waiting to be told.